In 1672, a servant in a wealthy English household walked into a dark larder and found something terrifying. Hanging from the ceiling was a joint of veal, emitting a glowing greenish-white light. The servant was paralyzed with fear. But when they alerted the master of the house, the natural philosopher Robert Boyle, his reaction was entirely different. Boyle was sick in bed with a head cold from testing a new telescope, but he immediately ordered the glowing meat brought directly into his bedroom for overnight observation. He didn't see a demonic portent. He explicitly recorded his emotional state as wonder and delight. He treated this glowing veal shank as a prestigious object worthy of his complete attention. That night, Boyle ran a series of rigorous empirical tests, exposing the meat to different conditions to determine exactly how long the bioluminescence would last and what its physical properties were. For early modern natural philosophers, the passion of wonder functioned as a professional tool. It was the specific cognitive catalyst that bridged the gap between encountering the unknown and actively investigating its causes. Modern science operates with a very different emotional baseline. Today, expressing wonder is treated as an amateurish or childish reflex. Scientists save their amazement for personal memoirs, keeping professional publications strictly objective. But the intellectual elite of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance operated under a concept called admiratio. This was a formal cognitive passion triggered when established categories were subverted, rooted in novelty, ignorance of the cause, and variations in local custom. The scientific revolution did not discard this feeling in favor of cold rationality. It placed wonder at the very center of inquiry. To understand how modern natural philosophy was born, we have to look at how early scientists mapped the preternatural, a specific zone where nature was believed to follow highly localized rules. The history of science is intimately tied to how the intellectual elite managed their emotions when bumping up against the margins of the known world. High medieval geographers envisioned a circular world. At the center, daily life was ordinary, but at the periphery, nature produced marvels. This is the Hereford Mappa Mundi from the 1280s. At the center of this map, Europe and the Holy Land, nature followed predictable customs. But at the outermost edges, bathed by the Great Ocean, nature was believed to play with greater freedom. Look closely at this section of the African coastline. You'll find specific marginal marvels cataloged here, like the winged dragon and the monstrous human races, including the one-legged cyopods and the headless blemmies. These beings were not considered unnatural. They were preternatural. They were rare, localized variations that proved the complexity and richness of creation. By placing these anomalies strictly at the edges of the Earth, the medieval mind organized the weirdness of reality. They kept the monstrous at a safe distance to ensure the stability of the center. The intellectual elite classified reality using a strict three-tier philosophical hierarchy: the mundane, the preternatural, and the supernatural. This diagram shows the two extremes. At the bottom, the mundane represents ordinary, repeating customs. At the top, the supernatural represents miracles, a divine suspension of rules. The preternatural occupies this iridescent middle tier. These marvels are rare, but operate strictly within nature's physical limits. It was the job of the educated elite to police these boundaries. Only a trained philosopher could determine whether an anomaly was a common misunderstanding, a holy miracle, or a true preternatural wonder. The 13th century writer Gervase of Tilbury established rules for this. He argued that wonder required an ignorance of cause, and that ignorance was relative. What baffled a peasant might be perfectly clear to a learned traveler. The preternatural was a logic of limits. It marked the absolute boundary of what humans could deduce through sensory observation alone. Over the centuries, the feeling of wonder evolved. The defensive horror of the early Middle Ages gradually gave way to an acquisitive, sophisticated pleasure. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, an insular Europe viewed the East as a source of existential terror and military threat. That terror is reflected in early depictions of the cynocephaly, or dog-headed men. They were drawn as barbaric, crouching beasts clutching raw meat. In this period, wonder was deeply fused with horror. It functioned as an intellectual defense mechanism, a way to process terrifying reports. Then came the 13th century Mongol piece. trade routes opened, Europe was flooded with luxury goods, like precious gems, rich, exotic spices, and shimmering silk. This economic influx shifted the narrative. The East transitioned from a terrifying military adversary into a zone of commercial and aesthetic desire. Merchants like Marco Polo returned with descriptions of the East that focused on beauty, massive scale, and excellence compared to anything available in Europe. As a result, the visual representation of the dog-headed cynocephaly changed completely. By the 15th century, they were illustrated standing upright, wearing rich robes and engaging in rational commerce with European travelers. When the margins of the world became profitable, the elite discarded their defensive horror. They replaced it with an appreciative, calculating wonder. As global travel became routine, the topography of wonder moved inward. Intellectuals stopped looking to the edges of the map and started focusing on highly specific regional anomalies within Europe itself. This illustration shows the marvels of Naples. We see localized preternatural science in action, like the therapeutic thermal baths of Pozzuoli and a bronze statue designed to repel volcanic ash. This obsession with local anomalies gave rise to the Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities. In spaces like Ferrante Imperator's Museum, with its massive crocodile suspended from the ceiling, princes and physicians physically collected strange facts to display their mastery over nature. Inside these cabinets, the ancient boundary between artificial inventions and natural oddities dissolved. This exact blending of art and nature directly inspired the foundational philosophies of Francis Bacon and René Descartes. By physically possessing a wonder, the intellectual elite transitioned from passive observers of nature's limits to its active curators. So why did this centuries-long obsession with marvels eventually vanish from elite science? The Enlightenment replaced the idea of localized natural customs with a model of uniform, ironclad laws. These mathematical rules were designed to be the same everywhere and always. In this predictable universe, ignorance of cause, the essential requirement for wonder, was no longer an acceptable state for a scholar. The intellectual elite began to view surprise as a vulgar notion, a sign of personal ignorance. By the 18th century, wonder was recast as superstition or enthusiasm. These were now seen as traits of the unlearned rather than the philosopher. This frontispiece of the Royal Society captures the transition. It illustrates a scientific community moving away from passionate inquiry and toward institutionalized, instrument-driven detachment. We didn't lose wonder because the world became less mysterious. We lost it because the intellectual elite decided that true enlightenment meant never allowing yourself to be surprised.